Welcome. For this lecture, we are going to focus on ATP, what it is and what it does. And I'm going to be referring to battery as an analogy, just makes it easier to remember. So let's go ahead and get started. So our bodies require energy. Why? Because we need to be able to do work, not only just physical work, but the work our cells do all the time. And so we need an energy that needs to be converted from the food we eat to a type of energy or molecule that the cells can use. So the types of things that the energy is used to do would be growth, and that's not necessarily just you growing, but also the cell and all the organelles inside. Cells go through reproduction. Movement, that could be muscular, more of a macro level, but it could also mean the movement of molecules in and out of the cells through the membrane. And then responding to the stimuli. So cells can respond to one another, they almost talk to one another, and also we have different stimuli, and that could be hormones, for example. So next is homeostasis, and that means a biological balance. So if we get off balance, like our teeter-totter there, things could go wrong inside the body, the cells could even die if it's extreme enough. So ultimately, the energy needs to come from somewhere. And originally, all of the energy will come from the sun. And so we're going to see a tie between photosynthesis and respiration working together to give this energy that we need to sustain life. So we've had this before, so let's do a little bit of a review. So organisms are classified how they obtain energy. So autotrophs are self-feeders, which means they make or create their own food. Heterotrophs, it means different feeders, so they are consumers, so they'll eat either other heterotrophs or autotrophs or plants. So on this, just for that review purpose, go ahead and pause the video, and then on your lecture sheet, go ahead and see if you can identify autotroph or heterotroph, and then I'll show you the answers. So hopefully you got that filled in. So let's go ahead and display the answers. So oak tree autotroph, butterfly is a heterotroph, the daisy autotroph, fungi as a decomposer, so that's a heterotroph, the praying mantis is also a heterotroph, and green algae, that is an autotroph. So hopefully you got all of those correct. So some of the main ideas with this lecture will be looking at the potential stored energy, and then the bonds that's created between the atoms, and then the releasing of that energy and how that cycles through. So I love this analogy. So if you put your hands together and kind of lock your fingers and you pull a little bit, so that's a stored energy. That's potential energy, waiting for it to be pulled apart. When I break the bonds or release my fingers, I'm releasing the energy, okay? So stored potential, releasing, breaking, and creating bonds. So I'm going to come back to that just a little bit later. So this is to show you how everything is linked together. So the flow of energy. So we have the sun, our solar energy. So that's going to start with photosynthesis as it's trapping that solar energy. And then I'm going to convert that through the process of photosynthesis and going to make glucose. And then we had food chains and food webs, so the energy is moved through the system. So starting off with the light and then converted through a chemical process to make glucose. And then the organisms, both plants and animals, in the food chains and food webs will use that energy. Next, we have cellular respiration. Now, sometimes people think, well, respiration, that's just breathing. We're looking at the cellular level. That is the breaking of the bonds or that glucose molecule to convert that into an energy our cells can use, and that is called ATP. So we're going to move from the glucose that was produced from photosynthesis, go through a process of cellular respiration, and one of the main energy is going to be ATP. And then the ATP is then inside each molecule, and that is what's going to drive the cell activities, whether it's moving different molecules throughout the cell, moving things in and out of the cell. So one thing to note is that plants have mitochondria also. And mitochondria, if you think back to the cell unit, that is the powerhouse of the cell. And the powerhouse is referring to that ATP molecule. So photosynthesis occurs in only plants, whereas cellular respiration occurs in both plants and animals because it needs to convert that glucose to ATP. So the plants also need to do that. So this analogy is going to look at how that energy is transformed. So I'm going to walk you through the top number one, and then we're going to relate it to what we've been talking about, and that is ATP in more specifically the mitochondria. So let's start here. So we have coal, oil, or natural gas, a type of fuel. It's going to be burned in a power plant. It's going to produce electricity, and then that electricity is a usable form of energy that we can use to run our appliances. So now let's compare that to how does that work inside a cell. So we have our energy. The fuel is going to be our carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. That's our macromolecules. It's going to be burned in the mitochondria. That inside the powerhouse, it's going to produce that ATP, and then that's going to run our cell activities. An example of that would be active transport. And remember, active transport is moving molecules with the help of ATP across the cell membrane. So again, so we have our fuel. It's going to be transformed in or burned or transformed in the mitochondria. It's going to convert that to a usable form of energy, ATP, and then it's going to be used. So we've been just saying ATP. What is ATP really? What does that stand for? It is adenosine triphosphate. And so if we break that down, the A in adenosine, and then the T, tri, and P, phosphate. Now that's going to be important because there's also ADP and AMP. So it's the number of phosphates. And we're going to get to ADP in a moment. We're not going to talk about the AMP. So we're just going to focus on ATP and ADP. Kind of a fun fact on how many ATP molecules that we use. So if we use a muscle, and we're just going to look at one, a bicep, it's going to recycle, and we're talking about the recycling of the ATP and the ADP. So it's going to go through 10 million cycles of each molecule every second in every cell. So it's turning. Okay, so why should we use ATP molecules? If we look at what do we need for a chemical reaction, again, it depends on how complex the chemical reaction is. So it will use, and you've seen calories before, so just number-wise, we're going to look at about 3.5 for a simple reaction up to 7.3 kilocalories in a chemical reaction. Well, an ATP molecule can hold its potential energy is 7.3 kilocalories. So it gives just enough energy to power those chemical reactions in order to have all those conversions of those molecules that our cell can use. Now, we've talked about when we looked at food chains and food webs, how when we go through a chemical reaction, that heat or light is given off. So remember, all atoms have to be accounted for. So if I have 7.3 kilocalories of the ATP, and in this instance example, if my chemical reaction is going to use 3.5 kilocalories, that means that 3.8 is given off as either heat or light. And so everything is accounted for. So you probably know this, that our body, the body heat that we have is going to result from the loss of energy during those energy transfers. So just sitting, not really exerting a lot of energy, our body is a certain temperature. The more active we are, then the temperature is going to increase and we are releasing a lot more energy. So when you're with a lot of people, that's why that space gets warmer, and especially if you're moving around, so like at a dance. And our bodies start to sweat in order to keep our bodies cool. So there's a homeostasis, so we don't exceed the temperature, and then it start affecting other cells in our body. So there are three parts to an ATP molecule. The one that changes, that's going to go from ADP to ATP, are the phosphate groups. The other two, adenine, this is a nitrogenous base, so you will see that again when we talk about RNA and DNA. The second part is ribose. This is a sugar, OSE is sugar. It's a 5-carbon sugar, which means it's a pentose, that's how it's classified. So at each of these points, there is a carbon, okay? So ribose, and you'll see ribose again when we talk about RNA. And then these are the phosphate groups. Now, how is it going to store this energy? How is it the potential energy that's held in this battery that our cells can use? So it's that bond, and it's found between the second and third phosphate group. So this bond has a lot of energy in it because it's easily broken. And then it can also easily reattach. So that phosphate's going to break off and reattach. So let's go ahead and see how that energy is released from the ATP. So when I break that bond between the second and the third phosphate group, then it's going to release energy. So just like what we were talking about here. Holding on, there's a potential energy, and then when I break it off, I'm releasing energy because I'm moving. So let's go ahead and look at it a little bit different diagram. So this right here, that's my adenine, that's my ribose, and then here's my 3 phosphates. And like a chemical reaction, so reactants, products, the yield is going to be what it's produced. So we have ATP, there's my 3 phosphates. ADP has 2, and then what was broken off was the 1 phosphate. And so as a result, it's going to produce energy. So ATP is going to be ADP plus the phosphate, and energy is going to be released. Now, how are these two molecules different besides just that third phosphate in ATP? So think of it this way. So I'm not sure if you can see this, but blinking right here, there's that bond, okay? So we have that bond between the second and third phosphate. And so that is, let me pull all this up. So triphosphate. So this is a fully charged battery, one that can be recharged over and over again. So ADP is adenosine diphosphate. I've got 2 phosphates. This one is uncharged. Not a lot of power there. So eventually it's going to have to be recharged. And then we have those phosphate groups that are found in the cell. So how is it recharged? The energy is required. It's going to attach that third phosphate onto the ADP. So the energy is stored in that bond. So there's the ADP, 2 phosphates. I'm going to attach my phosphate plus the energy that's going to help it recharge, and then I'm going to come up with an ATP molecule. So on this one, just how does it all work together, this cycling, this rechargeable battery? So if you want to have this cycle, I did not put it on the lecture sheet, you can go ahead and pause and take a screenshot before and after the animation. So we're just going to sit here, I'm going to play the animation, then I'm going to go back through and point out a few things. Okay, so let's start with the fully charged ATP molecule. And this is a cycle, so it's going to keep going and going. So you have the ATP, so here's my closed hand like before when we started. So we have a lot of potential energy and the bonds between the second and third phosphate. So when I break that, the phosphate's going to be released. I'm releasing my fingers, energy is released, and now I'm going to have an ADP molecule, diphosphate. And then in the cell, so I will pick up a phosphate, and when I recreate those bonds, add my phosphate, now the energy is restored, and now I'm back at my ATP molecule. So I hope that helps. If there's any parts you're a little confused about, you might want to go back and rewatch. I'll see you in class.